Let's read the second chapter. Last Sunday, we read the first chapter and had some things to say. So today we're going to read the second chapter, all of it, and look at some things as we read. Let's begin with verse 1. I'm reading out of the King James. Some of you have the NASB and some of you have the King James. And it came to pass in the month Nisan, in the 20th year of Artaxerxes, the king, that wine was before him, and I took up the wine and gave it to the king. Now I had not been before time, the King James says, sad in his presence. So Nehemiah had never been sad before the king before, but he was sad as a result of what we looked at last Sunday in chapter 1. He surveyed all the difficulties. Temple had been rebuilt. Now it was Nehemiah's responsibility to rebuild the wall of separation around the temple. So we dealt with separation. Now look at verse 2. Wherefore the king said to me, why is your countenance, or why is your face sad? Why do you look so sad? It was what he had encountered as he surveyed the difficulties in chapter 1. He saw enough to make him sad. No separation. Folks, that's what bothers me today more than anything else. Separation. So keep that in mind. Seeing you're not sick, the king saw that he wasn't ill, but he had a sad countenance. His face manifested it. And folks, I can almost tell some things about you, either your health or your spiritual condition, by looking at you and watching you and talking to you a few minutes. If you feel bad, I told Hollis, I said, Hollis, you feel better today than you felt last Sunday. He said, I surely do. He said, I have my bad days. Well, that's physical. If you're physically robust and you have a drooping countenance, then there's something else wrong with you. Let's face it. Something wrong with you. So watch this. Practical lessons, folks. And you're going to be amazed at what we'll get into here before we get through this morning and also in a few Sundays to come, the Lord willing. So why is your countenance or your face sad? Seeing you're not sick. This is nothing else but sorrow of heart. So it's not your physical condition, it's a heart problem with you. And the king could detect something was wrong with Nehemiah. Now notice, then I was very sore afraid. He knew that the king was really giving him a once-over. Now look at verse 3. Then the king said to me, for what dost thou make request? In other words, what are you requesting? Nehemiah, what is your request? It's interesting, isn't it? So I prayed to the God of heaven. You notice he prayed to the God of heaven before he answered the king's question. That's important, isn't it? And I said to the king, if it pleased the king, and if your servant have found favor in your sight, that you would send me to Judah, to the city of my father's tombs, that I may build it. That I may build it. Notice his request. Verse 6. And the king said to me, the queen, that is, his wife, also sitting by him, for how long shall your journey be? How long are you going to be gone? That would begin to be a little encouraging to him, don't you imagine? You remember now, Nehemiah was the king's cupbearer. Going back to chapter 1. He had a very important job for the king. So how long will your journey last? When will you return? So it pleased the king to send me. Here you see providence working in favor of Nehemiah going and leading Israel to rebuild the wall of separation. And I set him a time. I told him when I wanted to go. Moreover, I said to the king, if it please the king, let letters be given me to the governors, that is, the rulers of the various provinces through which he must travel in order to get there. And after all, those governors were the enemies of the Israelites. So he wanted some letters from the king to present to them when he went through enemy territory. That would signify that it was the desire of the king that he go through their areas. And folks, that shows you how the providence of God can work. Even in the wicked heart of a king. And a letter unto Asaph, the keeper of the king's forest. This is verse 8. That he may give me timber to make beams for the gates of the palace, or the fortress, which is by the temple. The King James says, by the gates of the palace, which appertained to the house, and for the wall of the city, and for the house of the temple that I shall enter into. And the king granted me according to the good hand of my God upon me. Now let's stop there for a moment. Or may I go ahead and read, and then we'll come back and take some high points. Beginning with verse 9. But you see the providence of God here, don't you? And how God works. When we're in the will of God, the Lord can open the door for us where you and I could never open it. With all of our pleading. You see, the sovereign God of the universe can change, if he so desires, the ideas that the president of this country might have. And if he doesn't change them, then it's in his will. The secret part of his will we don't understand. But I want you to know that God is in control. And we better believe it. If we don't believe it, we don't believe the Scriptures. And it's encouraging to know that the God whom I worship, he can open doors that you could never open, I could never open. Now notice verse 9. So I came to the governors beyond the river and gave them the king's letters. Now the king had sent captains of the army and horsemen with me. He even sent some men along as their bodyguards. Can you imagine that? Here were unregenerate people protecting Nehemiah. Now look at verse 11. So I came to Jerusalem and was there 3 days. And I rose in the night, I and some few men, just a few. There have always been a few that God uses, folks. Don't you want to be the few? The few. Neither told I any man what my God had put in my heart or in my mind to do at Jerusalem. Neither was there any beast with me, save the beast that I rode upon. And I went out by night by the gate of the valley. I want to stop there for a moment. You know how many gates we're going to deal with that surrounded, that had been torn down, surrounded the temple? 12 gates. You mean 11 wouldn't suffice? No. A great type. Did you know there are 12 gates to the New Jerusalem that's going to come down from God out of heaven? So here's a type of it. Now, how many gates are there? Let me point out the gates. I'll just give these to you. You can write them down, because it'll be difficult to deal with each one. We'll deal with some this morning and some more later. But first of all, you have 12 gates, and the first is the valley gate. Chapter 2, verse 12. Secondly is the fountain gate. That's chapter 2, verse 14. Then you have the sheep gate. That's chapter 3, verse 1. You have the fish gate. Chapter 3, verse 3. You have the old gate. Chapter 3, verse 6. You have the, as it is in the King James, the dung gate or the refuse gate. Chapter 3, verse 13. You have the water gate. Not the water. Well, get the water gate off your mind for a moment. That's entering into America's politics now. But it's called the water gate. Chapter 3, verse 26. You have the horse gate. And that's chapter 3, verse 28. You have the east gate. Chapter 3, verse 29. And the east gate, by the way, is a famous gate, folks, in the study of biblical prophecy. And then you have the Mifkad. Chapter 3, verse 21. Ephraim gate. And chapter 8, verse 16. And the prison gate, chapter 12 and verse 39. 12 gates. Now, having mentioned those gates, let's begin with verse 13 and read the rest of the chapter. And I went out by night by the gate of the valley, even before the dragon well, and to the refuse gate, it really is, called the dung port here, and viewed the walls of Jerusalem, which were broken down, and the gates thereof were consumed with fire. Then I went on to the gate of the fountain, and to the king's pool, but there was no place for the beast, or for my mount, that was under me to pass. Then went I up in the night by the brook, and viewed the wall, and turned back, and entered by the gate of the valley, and so returned. And the rulers knew not where I went, or what I did. Neither had I as yet told it to the Jews, nor to the priests, nor to the nobles, nor to the rulers, nor to the rest that did the work. Then said I to them, you see the distress that we are in? Ask you a question this morning. Do you see the distress that we're in? The lack of separation? Have you made a personal investigation? Do you see the stress that we're in and the distress that we have? And then he says, how Jerusalem lies in waste. Lieth waste. And the gates thereof are burned with fire. Come and let us build. Now notice Nehemiah says, come, let us build. Folks, we're thinking about a building. But the building is only a symbol of what we had better be experiencing in our personal lives. That we be no more a reproach. Before whom? The sovereign God whom we serve and love. Or love and serve. Better order. All right, we just have 3 more verses to go. Then I told them of the hand of my God. Now it's time for me to reveal to them, which was good on me, as also the king's word that he had spoken unto me. And they said, let us rise up and build. So they strengthened their hands for this good work. But, there's always a but, folks. But, go back to verse 10. When Sanballat and Tobiah. Verse 19, but when Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the servant, the Ammonite, and Geshem the Arabian. In other words, all those Muslims. What did he say? Heard it, they laughed us to scorn. And you'll find in chapter 4 these feeble Jews. And we'll look at that in just a moment, because we'll tie it all together. So Sanballat, Tobiah, and Geshem. They were the leaders. They laughed us to scorn and despised us and said, what is this thing that you do? Will you rebel against the king? Surely the king is not for this. See, they didn't know that the king had given his blessings to Nehemiah. Verse 20, then answered I them and said to them, 3 things here, and notice this. Tremendous outline in these 3 things. The God of heaven will give us success. He'll cause us to prosper. Who will do it? The God of heaven. Secondly, we, his servants, will arise and build. And thirdly, you have no portion, watch this, folks, and notice what is said to the enemies. You have no portion, nor right, nor memorial in Jerusalem. Do you see why the Orthodox Jews until this day feel the way they do about people who are trying to take Jerusalem? Here it is, folks. And it'll never cease. And I want you to know it doesn't make any difference who goes from America over to try to get them back to the negotiating table. Oh, they may force them for a while, but you can't change their minds. Now let's go back and look at some high points of this and how practical this portion of Scripture really is. There is no service for God without sacrifice. No service. It doesn't have to be a sacrifice of money. It doesn't stop there. There has to be a sacrifice of time, sacrifice of one's talents. I said there's no building by the individual Christian apart from sacrifice. If you've never sacrificed, folks, you've never started. You've never started. You have to sacrifice. You've got to sacrifice your time, sacrifice your money. And before you get through reading the book of Nehemiah, you're going to find that Nehemiah had some problems. He had a lot of problems from the outside, opposition from the outside, but he also had some problems within. And so, folks, you have to be prepared for it. And the leader has to be prepared for it. Opposition not only within, but also without. But the greater opposition comes from without. I said, no winning without warfare. No gaining spiritual growth without much sacrifice and much study. I have absolutely no time for any preacher who is too lazy to study. Look at chapter 4 for a moment. I want you just to get a taste of the opposition. Chapter 4, let's read just 2 or 3 verses. Then we'll go back to chapter 2. Take some of the highlights of chapter 2. But it came to pass that when Sanballat heard that we builded the wall, in other words, when construction began, that was more than the enemies could take. He was wroth. In other words, he was furious. He was very angry and took great indignation and mocked the Jews. Look at verse 2. And he spake before his brethren and the army of Samaria and said, now notice what he said. Number 1, what do these feeble Jews? What are they doing? These few feeble Jews. You know, God didn't choose the nation of Israel because it was a great nation. He chose them because He chose to choose them. It's just that simple. To confound the mighty, you'll find the answer in 1 Corinthians 1, to confound the mighty. So, what are they doing? Notice number 2. Will they fortify themselves? Will they really fortify themselves? Will they build themselves up against such opposition? Number 3, will they sacrifice? What do they have to sacrifice? Well, if they don't have money, they can sacrifice their time, their labor, their brawn. Number 4, will they make an end in a day? They're going at this thing like they're going to complete their work in a day. This is a mammoth job to rebuild the wall. Number 5, will they revive the stones out of the heaps of the rubbish? And I want you to know, you'll find out later that the opposition on the inside was like this. When the Israelites themselves saw the rubbish, then they became discouraged. How in the world can we do anything with all of this rubble? And folks, discouraged people are very difficult to work with. Now notice verse 3. Now Tobiah the Ammonite was by him, he said, even that which they build, if a fox were to go up, he shall even break down the stone wall. Whatever they build is not going to last. A fox could go up against it and break it down. Now that's ridicule, isn't it? Now what does Nehemiah do? He does what any other God-called person will do. Hear, O our Lord, for we are despised, and turn their reproach upon their own head, and give them for a prey in the land of captivity, and cover not their iniquity, and let not their sin be blotted out from before thee, for they have provoked thee to anger before the builders. Oh, listen to verse 6. So we built the wall. We built the wall. And all the wall was joined together unto the half thereof. For the people had a mind to work. Drop down to verse 9. Nevertheless, we made our prayer unto God. They had a mind to work and a heart to pray. And thirdly, what did they say? Set a watch against them day and night because of them. So they had a mind to work, a heart to pray, and an eye to watch. And we have to begin our watching by looking at ourselves. Now back to chapter 2. Nehemiah's countenance was sad because of the condition of Jerusalem as he saw it. Folks, my heart is sad today as I look at professing Christendom. As I look at professing Christendom, my heart is sad. And if our hearts can't be made sad by looking at professing Christendom and seeing how little people are being subjected to when it comes to the things of God, giving them the whole counsel, equipping them, they're not being equipped. So laying the matter to heart, Nehemiah did not begin to speak to others about what they should do, but he first was concerned about what he himself could do. I'm so anxious to get into some things that I feel that we need doctrinally in order to be able to withstand the opposition that we're going to encounter in the very near future. So Nehemiah made a personal investigation of the condition of Jerusalem. That was chapter 1. Building requires vision. It requires planning. And folks, it requires cooperation. Everybody has an agenda. Everybody has his own opinion. But someone has to lead out that has a perspective of the whole situation. And he is the one to whom all others must look for leadership. And folks, that leadership is in the elder of the church. And there has to be cooperation. You have your agenda, and it's all right for you to think. And it's all right for you to look at yourself and look at the situation as a whole. But first of all, do you know enough about the Scriptures to look at the Scriptures objectively and the situation objectively and look at the outcome objectively? You can't do it without a workable knowledge of all the Scriptures and all the divine principles that God has committed to our trust. Opposition to God's work comes not only from the outside, as we've already seen, but also from the inside. From the outside, opposition comes what? First of all, let me give them to you. I'll give you the verse, give you the point, give you the verse. Grief. That's the first thing. Chapter 2, verse 10. Laughter. Chapter 2, verse 19. 3. Wrath. Chapter 4, verse 1. 4th, mocking. Chapter 4 and verse 1. 5. Conflict. Chapter 4, verse 8. And finally, subtlety. Chapter 6, verses 2 and 3. Turn to chapter 6. We didn't look at that one this morning. Let's read verses 2 and 3. Now it came to pass when Sanballat and Tobiah and Geshem, the Arabian, and the rest of our enemies heard that I had builded the wall, and that there was no breach left therein. Notice, no breach left therein. Though at that time I had not set up the doors upon the gates. That Sanballat and Geshem sent unto me, saying, Come, let us meet together. Come on. They turned to be ecumenicalist. And we hear that today. You've got to consider others. After all, we're in this thing together. We have a common enemy. So come, let us meet together. That's treacherous. That's very treacherous. So it's treachery. Nehemiah saw through all the hypocrisy. Can you see it? Are you capable, whenever you talk to someone and he may talk a good fight, but you know that he never has really performed a good fight? Don't you think it's kind of hypocritical? Can you see through the hypocrisy? Let us meet together in some one of the villages in the plain of Ono. And you know what Ono means? The literal meaning of Ono? His iniquity. That's the meaning of the name. But they thought to do me mischief. And I sent messengers unto them, saying, I am doing a great work. And I'll answer the answer that he gave. You want me to come down to the plain of Ono? To the plain of iniquity? To your plain? I'll never do it. So my answer is, oh no. Not the name, but my answer is just, oh no, I'll never do it. So I'm doing a great work so that I cannot come down, and should the work cease while I leave it, and come down to you. No compromise, folks. That's what it means. No compromise. So it takes, to do a great work, investigation. Secondly, cooperation. And thirdly, determination. Determination. Now I want you to look at the statement. I called your attention to it as we were reading it. The last part of verse 8. And the king granted me according to the good hand of my God upon me. This term expresses God's what? Number one, His purpose. You'll find all the things that I'm going to give you now in just a few minutes in this one statement. According to the good hand of my God, which was upon me. So we have God's purpose. That's Acts 4:28. If you want to know about God's purpose. Secondly, God's power. 1 Chronicles 29, verse 18. Thirdly, God's sovereignty. Psalm 31 and verse 15. Number 4, God's providence. 1 Chronicles 29 and 16. Next, His ability, God's ability to supply every need that we might have. Psalm 104:28. God's ability to overrule what somebody is attempting to do. Overrule. And overruling for good. Nehemiah 2 and verse 8. The verse we're looking at. And finally, God's guardianship of us. John 10 and verse 28. We're protected not only by the sovereign hand of God the Father, but also the crucified hand of Jesus Christ. We're held secure. We're held secure. Then look at verse 10. When Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the servant, the Ammonite, heard of it, it grieved them exceedingly that there was come a man to seek the well-being or the welfare of the children of Israel. Whatever I may do as the teaching elder for your spiritual benefit, do you think the devil likes it? You think he's happy about it? If it is given to strengthen you and to equip you, he's going to do everything he can to try to destroy it. If nothing else, to get those who are weak in the church to become disgruntled until their attitude is reflected in the heart of the person whom God has called to teach and edify. I've often thought, it never has happened, it never will happen. But I've often thought about the time that I've spent in worrying and thinking through problems, that if I did not have those problems, but really those problems have caused me to have a great appreciation for what I'm studying and digging into various aspects of truth. But think about the time wasted. Really, the time wasted. So the enemy is not concerned about your spiritual welfare. He's against it and will do everything he can to hinder it. So any move made for the spiritual welfare of God's people is always met by opposition in some form or fashion. As Nehemiah was opposed by Sanballat and Tobiah, I want to see if you can bring to mind this morning one of the great apostles of the New Testament who had a twofold enemy. Two men that he had tremendous conflict with. And so what Sanballat and Tobiah were to Nehemiah, Hymenaeus and Philetus were to Paul. You want to read about it? Read 2 Timothy chapter 2. And the last verses will tell you what Paul had to encounter in those two men. And then we told in verse 11, so I came to Jerusalem, and I was there 3 days. So this describes a person determined to become acquainted with the true state of affairs as they existed in Jerusalem. And that's to be my concern. That's the leadership's chief concern. Your concern may be to you a much greater concern, but it may be more independent and with 2 or 3 or 1 or 2. When my concern is for the overall picture of the work that is to be accomplished. Well, let's look at a few of the gates in closing this morning, just to show you the significance of gates. 12 of them. And we will eventually look at all 12 of them, but I want to give you a little bit, and I've got about, well, we'll have time maybe to discuss one this morning. One. We want a little time left for the building committee if they want to have a meeting or anything, or any questions they want to ask one another. So let's look first of all this morning at the gate of the valley, or the valley gate. It is mentioned in verse 13. This is the first gate. And notice where we start. It's the valley gate. And what does the valley gate suggest to you and me? Think about it for a moment. There's a deep valley, and there's the highest height. We've got to go through the valley in preparation for the height, folks. Does that make sense to you? So we've got to go through the valley before we start climbing. So the valley gate. And the valley gate suggests going out in a lowly spirit. There's nothing that will bring you to that lowly attitude of mind like going through the valley experience. So when Paul surveyed Corinth, let's give a New Testament example of this. When Paul surveyed Corinth, he said, out of much tribulation and distress of heart, I wrote to you with many words. 2 Corinthians 2 and verse 4. So all of these various experiences are for our spiritual good. The only way we can really know the state of ruin is in the spirit of tears, weeping, sad heart because of the condition. Not in a sensuous spirit. And that doesn't mean that we're not to censure things that need to be censured. But not in that spirit. But in a brokenness of heart over the spiritual ruin. It's a lot easier to censure somebody else, to criticize somebody else, than it is to criticize oneself. Oneself. So the valley gate. So the only way we can really know the state of ruin is to know it in the spirit of the valley. Experience that we must go through. So the Lord puts His servants through experiences of this kind. And proof of this is even found in Revelation 1:17 and 18. And Apostle John could not write the revelation that he wrote without having had that experience. And you need to look at those 2 verses when you have time. References made in connection with this gate, the dragon well. And the dragon well speaks of that which is evil. It was a source of worldly refreshment. but the power of evil was in it. And we have to be very careful, folks. Something may look good and pleasant to us in the world, but we better watch out. There could very well be something evil connected with it that would distract us. So the dragon well. And the devil gives refreshments as well as pleasure. You know, the devil can just really make you happy. He can give you pleasure. And he can give you refreshments. And some people can't make a distinction between the devil's pleasure and the pleasure of what they think is the Spirit, but it's not the Spirit of God. Not the Spirit of God. So the dragon well. So Paul continually feared such teaching at Corinth, at Galatia, at Colossae. And folks, I fear, I said, a lot of teaching that's going on today that should not go on. That's just like when I read this article that I told you about to begin with, which is a great illustration. And then when I read the conclusion of the article, my spirit dropped. My spirit dropped. Now, we only looked at one gate this morning. There are 12 of them. And we will, before we get through with the first 8 chapters, and we'll look briefly at the other references and give you a summary of the other chapters. Do we see what we're faced with? You say, preacher, I think this is a waste of time. If there's anybody who thinks this is a waste of time, you're the very person I'm talking to, and you don't know it. The very person I'm talking to. If you think you've outgrown this, you're the very person I'm speaking to. We never get to the place that we do not need to have our minds refreshed as to what our responsibilities are. Let's stand for the benediction.